consume an entire conference in and of itself. We only have 90 minutes. So my plan is to have the panelists speak each for 10, 12 minutes or so, and conserve as much time as possible for the debate that surely must follow on this subject. Let me just, and I'm not going to introduce them extensively. The panelists are well known in this field, and you are in this field, so you undoubtedly know them, and their full bios are published in your programs. But I would like to introduce this panel by noting that everything in the human domain is embedded in history and historical context. And that is very true of U.S. efforts to promote or support or encourage or build democracy in the Middle East and the Middle East and North Africa region. I might also note that when we say U.S. support, there is both U.S. governmental support and non-governmental support. And that is important to remember, despite the fact that unlike humanitarian or economic development assistance, the United States government does dominate this field, there is still a very important role to be played by the non-governmental community in supporting democratic transitions. We shouldn't overlook that fact. I myself I'm Michael Miklaucic. I'm currently with the National Defense University. But I was one of the early democracy doctors and evangelical democracy promoter from 1981 when I implemented the first human rights promotion program in the Arab world under Presidential Directive 12, a Carter administration legacy that encouraged, in fact required, the promotion of human rights in our foreign policy and our foreign assistance programs. As you can imagine, that program was welcomed, shall we say, without great enthusiasm in the region. 1981, human rights in the region. In fact, in some countries it was simply too sensitive to have a U.S. governmental program on human rights, so we called it legal development, legal reform, judicial capacity building. It was only in the 90s that the government, the U.S. government, took a proactive and explicit role in promoting democratization in the region, and the success rate was quite modest, frankly. I am one of the people that was involved in that intimately in Yemen, Egypt, Jordan. That was enough. After my successes there, I was assigned to Africa. But you'll remember in 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a degree of euphoria about democratization, and that existed in the Arab world as well. But our programs, whether it was our fault or inevitable, were not impressively successful. And then, in this century, we had the biggest intervention historically in the Arab world by the United States to promote democratic transitions in Iraq. And again, I think the jury is still out on the future of Iraqi democracy, but many would argue, perhaps some of our panelists will argue, that that experience tarnished both the United States as a catalytic force promoting or supporting democracy, and, as Robin Wright said, the notion of democracy itself. I can, from my own experience, I was recently in Oman on a personal vacation, if you can believe it. Wonderful place to be on vacation, and just in an interactive communication with an Omani, he said, "We love Americans, please don't bring us democracy." That hurts, but I understand. I want just to, as our true experts share their insights, I just want to pose a few questions that you might want to consider. Sir, please join us. I'm glad you're here. Welcome. I want to just propose a few questions that you might consider as they are sharing their insights. How do we apply the holistic approach to democracy support in a time of excruciating austerity? How do we apply a regional approach when, for example, USAID is closing missions? How do we manage the risk that the people that associate with us, our counterparts, might become endangered by that association? What role should the armed forces play? Our armed forces and Arab armed forces. It is utterly unviable, in my opinion, to try to promote a democratic transition without taking very careful account of what is usually the best resourced, often a very talented and capable institution in a country. What should the role be? Those are just some questions you might consider. There are many others, but I'm going to be very strict with the panelists' time, so I'll be strict with my own, and turn the panel first to Dr. Ziadeh. You just walked in, but you're first on the list. Would you like to go first?
Yes.
To Dr. Ziadeh. Again, the bios are provided for you. They're very impressive. I suggest you read them.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the center for this opportunity. It's became this conference actually the voice of the Arab Democrats linked to Washington foreign policy community. And it's worthwhile to look after 2 years of all this transformation in the region, what's happened there. Some countries looks they are on their pathway into democracy, hopefully, especially Tunisia. It's a very promising country, but in the autumn, it's now look to the situation in Syria. Just arrived yesterday evening from Istanbul, where we have endless meetings for the opposition. Which unfortunately it can lead to nowhere. I think we saw in Syria the price of the inactions from the international community. The tragedy where the Syrians they are living in right now, I can see 90% of that it's on the responsibility of the international community decision of taking inaction's role. Where from the beginning, the story it was clear, where the Assad regime is insist to use all types of weapons, all the state sources of guns, plastic missiles, and now that we are debating intensively about the use of chemical weapons, and basically what we are sure for 100% the use of the sarin gas. We have the case of Al-Khatib family in Aleppo, where actually a mother of 63 years old has died along with 3 of her children for the use of sarin gas. And now the Assad regime is using extensively this type of gas in East Ghouta, where actually he lost all of his military bases and his prisons in East Ghouta. And this is the only way for him actually to keep at least control of that area by using such type of chemical weapons. I mean, always it's clear that the Assad regime is testing the international community from the day one. He start now the estimate number, the total number of people being killed, we can say 1,200,000. If any dictator actually killed, let's say 5,000 in a day, maybe that will be generate an action from the international community. But what the Assad did is actually he did that day by day he start from 10, 20, then he start escalating the use of the weapons to test the reaction from the international community. When he see the inaction, that encourage him to do more. Last year, no one expected or talked about the use of the Air Force. Now the Assad, they have from 38 to 45 airstrikes every day in different cities. And basically in what we call the liberated areas, in Idlib, Aleppo, all of that, he targeted the bakeries and all of that to send a message to the population there that it's very difficult for the opposition to govern these areas where the basic things they cannot deliver it and to the population. I've been in Aleppo twice and see how the situation quite difficult, even that to manage to get food, to get water, to get even that the to smuggle within the street, which insecure at all. After that, when see the Assad regime see there is no actions or response from the international community, he start using intensively the airstrikes. The second phase of that, the use of the long-range missiles with the different types of Scud. The Syrian, they have at least 420 from these from Russia. The first use of the Scud missiles was in December 2012. Of course, the United States confirmed the use of that, and the NATO's confirmed of that. And both actually, they start counting the number of the Scud missiles being used without any actions. And the Syrian, they have nothing to do with it to combat or at least such kind of missiles. You know, the only way that the Syrian, they can avoid such kind of missiles is the Facebook. Do you know how? Because actually the only place that the Assad launched such kind of missiles from Al-Qutayfa in Damascus suburbs in brigade called 155. And when the Assad launch such kind of missiles, it takes 15 to 17 minutes. This is why an activist who are living in Damascus suburb, when they saw missiles launched there, they posted on the Facebook that in specific time there is a Scud missiles being launched. And this is why the people, they have expected in Aleppo or in Idlib or the northern part of it, they have 15 to 17 minutes to pray if the missiles hit them, to die at least in while they are praying, or at least to avoid, and there is no way to avoid such kind of missiles. Right now, more than 3,000 people in the northern part of Syria killed because of the use of such kind of missiles. Of course, again, it was testing. It was testing. When the Assad regime see no actions from the international community, he started using such kind of missiles in full scale. Now he's using not only against the north, but also against the southern area. It's basically Daraa, Suwaid, and other areas where the Assad lost control. And the last phase of that, the test of the use of the chemical weapons. The Assad start in February, where the first test was this year, the use of that. There was a huge, in the media, and President Obama, he said that the use of chemical weapons should be a red line. And later on, start the Assad regime using that in different places and in different areas. Of course, no actions. We're just getting in the media, in the news day by day, that we don't know, we are not confirmed. But with the same time, the people, it's clear from the YouTubes and from the videos, and the last video being published on the Le Monde newspaper in France, it's clear that the people is dying not because the live ammunition, but because the breath of such kind of chemical or gas. And again, there is no actions of doing. What we expecting that the Assad in the coming weeks and months to use more and more of that, because it's proved there is no actions taken against even that President Obama. He said that this is a red line. I think this is why encourage the Assad to do more. And now we saw also the involvement of Hezbollah. Before that, we have rumors, we have incidents here and here. And now Hezbollah involvement in the area, more than 1,000 to 1,200 Hezbollah fighters in Al-Qusayr, in Damascus suburbs, in Aleppo and in other areas, against their statements, but there is no actions, even that we expected much more harsh actions from the United States, because at least that test the power of the United States, where if the United States allowed for Hezbollah and Iran again to control areas in Syria, this should be a question mark for the U.S. policy in the whole region. Because what's the Assad lacking right now is the human sources. And there is no elaboration or no explanation of the Assad, let's say, ability to recontrol some areas in Al-Ateba and in Al-Qusayr and in Wadi al-Dif, in Idlib and in other areas without the human sources that the Hezbollah is provided. They are well-trained, skilled fighters, and and this is why we expected in the coming weeks more involvement from the Hezbollah, because there is no actions from the international community seen, where there is now a huge gap where the international community stand talking about peace process, Geneva II, and all of that, and the situation on the ground where a huge gap between the two levels. And we don't, maybe we anticipated and expected maybe in the coming days that the Iranian also announced more Iranian fighters to come in Syria. Especially they confirmed right now, Qasem Soleimani and others, they are in Syria just for advising. We know for sure that there is sometimes they are fighting, but there is no full scale of that. I mean, I will end it by saying that the Syrian story, it's the story of the inaction from the international community. And if the inactions continue, we expect that Syrian tragedy, where millions of Syrians living abroad in different areas. My hometown is Daraya, where actually is 7 kilometers south of Damascus. The population of Daraya is 240,000. Only 2,000 left in the city. My mother in Turkey, my sister in Jordan, my brother in Lebanon. This is one single family. And this is it's the same story for millions of Syrians. If we allow that to continue, I think we will have we should discuss more and more maybe in the questions about the spillover, because not the millions of refugees transferring the insecurity, instability in Lebanon and in Jordan and Iraq, but also there is other aspects of that on the humanitarian aspect, and by saying that there is still a chance for the U.S. To lead coalition to do an actions and to end the Syrian crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ziadeh, for that somewhat discouraging but realistic lens into what's going on in Syria. For a historical approach, we have Professor Peter Mandaville from George Mason University to speak on the evolution of U.S. policy towards Islamists. Sir.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's always very dangerous to speak on the panel immediately following lunch, so let me telegraph up front my sort of key points in case you fall asleep during the rest. I'm going to talk a little bit about how U.S. policy towards Islamist parties has evolved over time. And although I was billed as speaking a little bit more historically in orientation, as we got closer to the event, I found my own views on these issues kind of hardening a little bit, and so I actually do want to spend as much time, I think, addressing the contemporary context of U.S. Islamist policy. And I'll sort of telegraph my current status there simply by saying that I have been, for many years, among the most vocal, sometimes to my detriment, advocates of the United States government being more forward-leaning in its willingness to talk to and engage with Islamist parties throughout the Arab world. And I continue to believe that is the case, quite simply because these are groups and movements that are serious political players. There is no route to eventual democracy in these countries that does not involve working through and with Islamist parties. However, I find myself in a position today where I think that the US government is absolutely falling flat on its face in terms of calling these parties and movements to account for certain actions that they've been taking that are fundamentally detrimental to the development of democracy in their countries. And I'll speak to this point specifically with regard to the case of Egypt, because the Tunisian case, as we've heard this morning, is, I think, somewhat different. I think the Ennahda party and its leadership has, with respect to the constitutional process, been far more deliberative in how it's moved forward with that process. And of course, the political realities on the ground in Tunisia are very different, right? In Tunisia, you have an actual consolidated, well-developed and well-resourced secular liberal component of the political spectrum that is, frankly, missing in Egypt. Historically, I think there's some mythology that needs to be put to rest with respect to the question of how the US government has viewed Islamist parties. There's been this mythology around the idea of one man, one vote, one time, right? That famous speech that Ed Jurigian gave in 1992 in the aftermath of the Front Islamique du Salut, almost winning the Algerian elections. The idea there being that Islamists would most likely make instrumental use of democracy in order to get into power, and once they captured the state, they would dismantle democratic systems so that they be voted out of office. If you look at the patterns of Islamist behavior in parliamentary and formal political processes over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, I think it's fair to say that there is overwhelming evidence that by this point Islamist parties have fully internalized the procedural dimensions of democracy. That is, seeing elections as the most legitimate way to pursue their agendas, and win or lose respecting the results of those elections. Now, of course, that's one dimension of democracy, and it's a fairly anemic definition of the democracy that depends solely on whether or not elections take place and whether their results are respected. And so there are whole other dimensions of democracy that relate to notions like respect for pluralism, political pluralism, and here I think things are a little bit more complicated. But this one man, one vote, one time thing, I think has held within it the idea that the United States government has some sort of ideological aversion to Islamism. The idea that the US government doesn't want to do business with these groups because it disagrees with them at the level of ideology. I think that's just faulty analysis. I think if you look at key moments where the US government has seemed to have to make a decision with respect to Islamist parties, it's actually been the nature of US bilateral relations with specific countries that has governed how the US government has approached those issues far more so than ideology. One example is U.S. policy towards the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Now, during the late 1970s, throughout the 80s, even into the early 1990s, the U.S. government had frequent, routinized, mundane engagement with the Muslim Brotherhood on a very regular basis. It was just a standard facet of U.S. diplomatic outreach. From the early 1990s, as a function of Egyptian domestic politics, the Mubarak regime specifically asked the US government to stop talking to the Muslim Brotherhood. And that was where a change in US policy took place. Not because the US government decided that it was ideologically opposed to Islamism, but because their good friend, Hosni Mubarak, effectively asked them to stop talking to the Muslim Brotherhood in order to make it more easy to discredit the Ikhwan in Egypt. Fast forward to 2006, the victory of Hamas in the 2006 Palestinian legislative elections, which appeared to cause the U.S. government, I think the technical term is to freak out. Right? And I think the assumption there was, oh, the U.S. can't stand it when Islamists get voted into power. I don't think that's what went on there at all. I think half of the U.S. government reacted that way, largely as a function of U.S. policy towards Israel. It was seen as a result that threatened a close U.S. ally. And the other half of the U.S. government, particularly those in the civil service, those involved in the technical dimensions of the disbursement of U.S. assistance, freaked out because a group that was on the designated list of State Department terrorist organizations had suddenly been elected into power. And that had all sorts of implications for the U.S. ability to disperse that kind of aid. So my sort of general basic point here, leading up to the present period, is that it's never really been about ideology and whether the U.S. can countenance Islamist ideology. It's really been a function of U.S. Regional policy in the Middle East that's governed U.S. relations with Islamist parties, which means that when these parties came into power from 2011, 2012 onwards, it wasn't that difficult for the U.S. to begin engaging and doing business with them. My concern here is that that all happened far too nicely and far too easily. That the U.S. almost went out of its way to avoid dealing with contentious issues and in the case of Egypt, very early signs that things were not going well. I think the U.S. has tended to hope that it can, with respect to Egypt at least, essentially slip back into a variation on the rules of the game that governed its relations with the Mubarak regime, a sort of new version of the authoritarian bargain, which is the idea that so long as the Egyptian government respects certain kinds of regional security arrangements, namely, of course, the Camp David Accords, peace with Israel, but also other things the U.S. likes, such as overflight rights, counterterrorism cooperation, things like that. So long as those interests are respected, then the U.S. won't raise too many concerns about what goes on within the Egyptian domestic realm. I think this is where we've kind of fallen off the train in terms of the United States being able to follow through and be consistent with the commitments that it itself made in the immediate aftermath of the phenomenal events of 2011, which was to say, in effect, if you look back at speeches by President Obama, then Secretary of State Clinton, saying, okay, now the United States is truly supportive of democracy in the region. We get it now. We get it. The people want democracy, and so now we're really going to support democracy. And yet, we seem to have seen this kind of backsliding. My concern is that, again, and I'll speak directly and to the case of Egypt, simply because I think the U.S. is encountering real problems and turbulence in its Egypt policy right now. In the case of Egypt, I think we have a government that's being ruled by the Freedom and Justice Party and by President Morsi that is behaving in decidedly authoritarian fashions. I don't necessarily believe that Islamist ideology is the source of that authoritarianism. I think the source of what we see as authoritarian behavior on the part of, or let me put it this way, non-pluralistic behavior at a time when political pluralism is absolutely crucial is really a product of the very fractious political impasse that Egypt is in today. So, should a group like the FJP compete for and try and get as much power as it can? Of course it should. And we should expect them to. These are political actors. That's what political actors do. They try to gather as much power for themselves as they can. However, in the context of a democratic transition, arguably, this is not what a political party committed to the development of genuine and sustainable democracy in a country should be doing. If you win 43% of the vote, but govern as if you'd won 100% of the vote, then I think you've got a recipe for disaster looming. And so I personally would like to see the U.S. Government be somewhat more forward-leaning in calling into account the government of Egypt for some of the policies that it's pursued through the course of the constitutional process, with respect to the judicial law, with respect to the shaping of the electoral law that will govern the next round of elections, to behave in ways that is consistent with that party's own commitments to bringing lasting democracy to Egypt, to pursue elements of what John Kerry in his presentation characterized this morning as moderate economies of scale, rather than more of a winner-takes-all approach that seems to be dominating Egyptian politics up to this point. So, just to wrap up, in Rashad Hussein's remarks at lunch today, when he was asked about whether the U.S. really supports democracy in the region, his response was to say, well, the Islamists won and we didn't freak out this time. And that seemed to be the best evidence that he had to offer, that the U.S. was supportive of democracy. Again, to me, that's a pretty sad response if that's the best that you've got. And Rashad is a good friend, and we've worked very closely together when I was in the government. But I think that's kind of what the U.S. position has been reduced to at this point. A new variation on the authoritarian bargain. We're simply slipping back into bad habits. And so, even though there's new political actors that the U.S. does not have well-developed, trusting relationships with at this time, and there's, in a sense, a desire to avoid conflict with the Egyptian government at a difficult and controversial time in that country's transition, I don't think that the cause of Egyptian democracy is helped by failing to call out policies and actions that ultimately threaten to undermine the development and consolidation of democracy in Egypt. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. You'll be happy later when you get a chance to tease out some of these controversial issues, and they are controversial. Next we go to Professor Marc Lynch from George Washington University to speak about the challenge of Islamists in power to U.S. democracy promotion.
All right, thanks. So let me start by saying that my topic for today, which I talked about with Radwan, predated the title of the session. So I was asked to talk about the challenges of Islamists in power, and that's what I'm going to talk about, at least for the first part. But I do want to try and say something about the panel's topic as well, about the U.S. and democracy promotion, and if our esteemed chair will let me, maybe say something about Syria as well. And I also coordinated with Peter yesterday about trying to make sure that we wouldn't duplicate each other too much, and that's difficult because Peter and I agree on a lot, and so I'm going to try not to overlap too much. Let me start, I think, with just a very simple statement, which is that we have the debate is often framed about whether or not the United States should support democracy, whether the United States should create democracy, and then in another sense, or Radwan's question about what will the United States do about Syria. And I always believe that this is a very poorly framed question, a very poor way of thinking about things. The U.S. does have a role, and it does matter, but January 25th in Egypt didn't happen because the United States decided to make it so. It happened because Egyptians decided to make it so, and we could make a choice to matter in one direction or the other on the margins, and I think we made some good choices there. But I think that far too often questions are posed as if the United States and the conversations that we have here in this room are going to be what is decisive, whether Syria manages to move beyond Bashar al-Assad, whether Egypt develops a robust democracy, whether Tunisia completes its transition. And so this is not to say the U.S. has no role, but I think we have to be very humble and very clear about what we can and cannot do. I think that as a matter of both personal normative commitment and analytically, I believe that the United States does have an interest in the consolidation of meaningful democracy, pluralism, participation across the Middle East. I think that over the long term, I think that the United States will have a far better relationship with the peoples and governments of the region if democracy is meaningfully consolidated there. I also think that you would have to be blind to not see that the democratization of countries is going to produce significant turbulence in America's relationship with those countries. It has produced significant turbulence. And we should be frank and honest about that. The United States has been the patron or the overseer of a regional order for decades, which has largely served the interests of the United States and its allies, and which has been extremely unpopular with the vast majority of people in the region. As those people begin to have more of a voice in the politics, in the policies of their governments, they are going to not want to continue the same things that their governments have done before, which the United States liked them to do, which means that there is an inevitable and necessary contradiction in the short term between the democratization of the Arab world and the daily routine management of American foreign policy goals. Nevertheless, if you take a broader view and you get away from the specifics of the U.S. role in the Middle East, and I'm glad Marina is here to give us that kind of perspective, you'll see that the democratization of Latin America posed the exact same problems and has been extremely good for the United States to see the emergence of consolidated democratic countries integrated well into the global economy. The same thing is true in Asia, where the democratization and the unsettling of authoritarian governments has produced a significant turbulence in those relationships. Just talk to our diplomats who have had to deal with the Okinawa issue in Japan or deal with the nationalist republic in Korea. These are difficult things. And yet, it has been much better for the United States to be allied, to be anchored within regions that are broadly democratic. So I think we need to keep both of those things very much in focus. A democratized Middle East will be much better for the United States in the long term, and it is going to be much more difficult for the United States in the short term. And I think that for the policymaker, the short term is what matters. For the academic, the long term is what matters. And I think that is the tension which runs through a great deal of the kinds of debates that we do have here. Now, on the specific question of Islamists in power, and the specific challenges which it poses, I think that Peter has done an excellent job and hit many of the points which I otherwise would have made. I would point out, though, that maybe I'll go historical since you chose not to, which is to say that America's involvement or thinking about Islamist movements does have a long history. I would say that the academic and the policy thinking about Islamists in the Middle East has been profoundly and deeply shaped by three things over the last decade at least. And those, of course, are the global war on terror, Al-Qaeda, and this broad struggle against violent extremism. And the second was this concern with democratization. And the third was the general recognition of the political status quo within which they operated, Islamist movements and the United States. In other words, three broad parameters that shaped our debate. And so, for example, one of the most frequently posed questions was, should liberals who care about the spread of pluralism, etc., support the political participation of Islamist movements in Middle Eastern, in Arab elections? And to me, the answer to this prior to 2011 was very, very obvious. Yes, of course they should, because you cannot have meaningful democracy which excludes a significant constituency within those countries. To me, this answer was obvious, and I would say that a significant number of true Arab liberals agreed with that, because they recognized that when Muslim brothers in Egypt were being thrown in jail and tortured for their attempts to participate in kind of semi-democratic elections, the liberal thing to do is to defend their right to participate. Now, I think that there's much less clarity about that now because, unlike then, Islamists now can actually win. And the fact that they can win is a change in the political context, of course, right? This is not a change necessarily in either the nature of Islamists, changes in their ideology, or changes in our interest towards them. But I think for everybody, what has changed is this. Okay. is the reality that they can now win. And that is what then frames all of the kinds of questions that Peter raised. During the global war on terror, in the good old days of the war on terror, for those of you in Washington, I think there was an urgent and I think extremely strategically important need for academics, analysts, and everybody else to point out seemingly obvious things which didn't originally get taken into account after 9/11. That the Muslim Brotherhood is not Al-Qaeda. That there are meaningful distinctions and divisions between different Islamist trends. That you need to be able to understand the politics and the trends and the ideas and ideologies of Islamists on their own merits, rather than conflating them all into an undifferentiated Islamist mass. And that was extremely important during the glory days of the global war on terror. And as that particular ideological struggle fades into the background, I think that people now are less concerned with trying to draw those distinctions, I think to the detriment of analysis often. But also, there's really interesting questions that are now raised. So for example, I would say that some of the strongest conclusions that we had over the last 10 years of our analytical and academic community were things such as the distinction between the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi groups. Because the Muslim Brotherhood participated in politics, whereas the Salafis preferred to remain outside of the formal institutional political realm. Well, that's totally gone. Salafis decided to join politics in Egypt, entered the short-lived parliament, and basically completely upended what had been a pretty strong analytical conviction. There was an idea that groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, something that I myself wrote, that said that there was at this point being roughly 2007, nothing that the Muslim Brotherhood could realistically do to demonstrate its commitment to democracy. Beyond its participation in elections, it's the documents that are put forward, its behavior in professional associations and student associations and the like. And that was right. But now the situation has changed. We now have 2 more years of new evidence in radically different institutional and ideological circumstances, and I think Peter's right. The verdict now is much more mixed. I would say, based on my conversations with lots of Islamist leaders, Egypt, Tunisia, elsewhere in the region, is that they also don't know. In other words, they're as confused as we are about many of these things because these organizations have been profoundly shaped by their political context. Knowing that you can never come to power is liberating. It enables you to take moral stands like supporting democracy, forming coalitions with liberals with whom you viscerally disagree on core ideological issues, stating all kinds of possible compromises of your core values. You can say them because you're never going to have to deliver upon them. Well, now that luxury is gone. And I think what you're seeing now is not just the unfolding of a nefarious scheme as Islamist groups reveal their true nature, but a genuine grappling with the difficulties of trying to figure out how to translate an inchoate ideology based on the assumption that you're always going to be out of power and your best option is a slow, patient building of an Islamic society from below, to a dizzying, even bewildering situation where you actually have to rule. Everybody in Washington likes to ask the question, will Islamists moderate in power? It's a bad question. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I think a better question is, will Islamists normalize in power? In other words, will they become normal political actors? A political party ruling, governing, failing, and being punished for their failures. And that, to me, is the crucial question in Egypt and Tunisia right now, is whether we will see these groups basically be punished for what seems to me, at least in the Egyptian case, their manifest failure in government. If they do not fail, then it's a different test. And if they are not punished, it's also a different test. But I think that all the issues that Peter raised so effectively are ones that will only be resolved once we see how this plays out. I'm assuming that Marina is going to give us lots of examples of how transitions which did not include Islamists had just as many problems. And that in fact there are common institutional themes in the difficulties of these transitions. I won't belabor them anymore because I'm getting that look from the moderator. Let me just kind of then wrap up with by going back very, very briefly to the question of Syria and then broaden it out back to what the U.S. should do. It'll be no surprise, Radwan, an old friend, we've been disagreeing about this for a long time, and we still disagree about what the U.S. should do in Syria, and this will surprise nobody in the debate. But I will say that I was very struck by his presentation saying that 90% of the suffering of the Syrian people is the fault of the international community for not acting. And I think this is exactly wrong. I'd be willing to accept 10% of the blame going to the international community, although I think even that might be too much. But I think the real problems in Syria are problems of Syria. Blame lies with Assad and his regime, with Iran, with Hezbollah, with an opposition which, despite having intense, urgent pressures and needs to organize themselves into a representative and effective body, has failed to do so. The decision, voluntary or involuntary, to militarize the uprising and turn it from a peaceful uprising against a brutal dictator into what is now an insurgency and a civil war, which is, I think, much less likely to succeed than the peaceful uprising before it was. The Gulf states, which funneled money and guns into armed groups and thereby helped to undermine the prospects for peaceful change and increase the odds that we would go from a peaceful uprising against authoritarian rule into a regionally fueled proxy war, which is what we now have today. I think Syria is an absolute disaster, and there's nothing that Radwan has said descriptively about the horrors of Syria today with which I disagree. But what follows from that and the role, the appropriate role of the international community in responding to that, I think we're in a very different place, and hopefully we'll have time to explore that discussion a bit over the rest of the panel. So thanks.
Thank you. A final panelist, Dr. Marina Ottaway from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. But prior to that, for quite some time, one of the pillars of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace program.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to tell you exactly what Marc Lynch thought I was going to tell you, but I'm going to draw on examples from other countries more broadly. Let me start out by saying that if we talk about the US role in democracy promotion in the countries of the Arab Spring, it's better to start out by saying it's very modest. And how successful we can be, it really depends on how modestly we defined our role in our capacity to influence the situation. First of all, there are two major problems, I think, in terms of the US playing a role in these democratic transitions. One is the lack of understanding of the situation, which is very, very important. And second is the unwillingness to make resources available, because this is also very important at this point. There is no point to saying we should start a Marshall Plan for such and such a country, because we are not going to start a Marshall Plan. The US economy and the US taxation system and everything else are not structured to allow us to do anything of that sort. So that I think we need to start out from the premise. First of all, what is it we don't understand about these countries? And I would say there are two things we don't understand. A, we don't understand what people want. We talk, it's something that really aggravates me. We talk about what people in the countries of the Arab Spring want. They want dignity, they want bread, they want democracy, and so on. I think it's worthwhile looking at the public opinion polls. And that give you some idea. The Pew Research Center has been doing some excellent surveys recently that really tell you how complicated the situation is. The latest one I have, and I'm sorry to also talk about Egypt, but the latest one of these opinion surveys that just came out last week, I think, was on Egypt. And it tells you a lot of very interesting things. It tells you that the overwhelming majority of Egyptians believe in democracy. It also tells you that the overwhelming majority of Egyptians believe that that all laws should be based on the Sharia, not just inspired by the Sharia, but based on the Sharia. Okay? Well, do we understand what that means? Can we put the two together in our own mind? it tells us that the Muslim Brothers have been losing some ground since the last elections, but it also tells us that they still are a lot more popular than the so-called liberal parties that the United States would like to see play a more prominent role. In other words, we simply don't understand the situation, and I think there is nothing more dangerous than thinking that we know what people want and therefore we can help people get what they want, because the fact is that we don't want. Second is the issue of resources. And I think it is quite clear that at this point the United States cannot make available, let me rephrase it, is not willing to change its budget, essentially, and its financial system in order to make available the resources that would be needed in terms of financing to make a difference in these countries. What the United States still has is a lot of expertise, and it's a lot of know-how on a lot of different things that I think many people want, even in the Arab world, if we were willing to make them available in the right way. Let me give you an example. We talk about how the Muslim Brothers in Egypt are not really opening their door to many ideas, many influences there, including from their own people. That it's a very exclusivist party. There was a young Egyptian-American lawyer who actually ended up by doing quite a bit of consulting for the Constituent Assembly, for the very fact that he was not pushing anything in particular, but it became clear, he was hanging around, and it became clear that he was a resource person. He was somebody they could go to when they were stumped on what is normal in countries, in different countries, what is typical in a constitution, what are some choices that countries make, and so on and so forth. And I think we have a lot to offer along those lines, as long as we know how to make it available. Let me talk first of all, among the things that we do know, but we very often choose to forget, is what are the typical dilemmas of democratic transitions that we find in all countries. And here I will draw on the experience of other countries, although I'll give you conclusions rather than specific examples. First of all is the issue of the struggle for power. I mean, democratic transition entails a huge struggle for power. We talked this morning as if somehow in a democratic system, you have political actors that act in the common interest, in the interest of the common good. Since when is this the case? Come on, we all many of us live in Washington, but since when is this the case? And I think what you see in all these transitions is that the struggle for power is particularly better, for the simple reason that there is no legality. By definition, in a transition, there is nobody who is entitled to be in such and such a position. It's really, dog fight dog to get to the bone, essentially, and this is perfectly normal. We decried the fact that there are too many political parties. Egypt, Tunisia cannot support as many parties that exist, and so on. Well, those probably will just disappear in with the next election cycle or a couple of election cycles. We have seen that in all democratic transitions all over, that we have seen far too many political parties come into existence and they get absolutely nowhere, and so on. There is a very vicious situation now. There is no doubt that the propensity to create too many parties is real. I mean, I have a very clear memory of a Tunisian gentleman who, after a long conversation in which he was talking about the necessity of the opposition parties to come together in broader coalition, he announced that he was in the process of forming his own party, because the only way in which he could participate in this process of the coalition formation if he had a political party himself. In other words, in order to be at the table, he had to have his political party. Well, you multiply that by all the ambitious politicians, and we know why there are as many political parties as you have. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind. The second is that we cannot really forget is how strong the clash of vision is. That there are really people that have very different agendas. And we forget in a country, well, the United States perhaps is re-experienced a somewhat hardening of the differences between the Republican and the Democrats. But for a long time, essentially, the United States has lived with twiddly-dee and twiddly-dum parties. And what we have, and I think we tend to forget, that these differences, whether they are ideological or power-based, are for real in a lot of countries. That it's not, this is, it may not be literally life and death, but they are certainly seen as very, very, very important. So I think we have to be a bit more aware, essentially, when we preach a reconciliation for everybody. Third, there is a clash of experience. You hear a lot nowadays in all the countries in transition. They are so inexperienced. And it's always the Islamists who are so. The PJD is so inexperienced, and Al-Nahda is so inexperienced, and certainly the FJP is so inexperienced. Of course they are inexperienced. This is normal in a transition. If you have parties that have monopolized power for many years, everybody else is inexperienced. And I think, and this is where one area where the United States could play a role, which is not in terms of decrying this inexperience, but try to do what can be done to provide that experience. And I have some very real suggestions here, in the sense that I think there are things that the United States can do. First, and the rest of the international community. First of all, really, Robin Wright at lunch talked about Ambassador Stevens, who wanted to bring people to this country, and certainly Europe can offer the same. To bring people over, but to bring people over also to study very practical things. It's not a question of just saying how the trip to see the United States, but very specific things. I'll give you an example. That the Party for Justice and Development in Morocco really made a concerted effort to send people here to get trained. This is before they were in power. I'm talking about 10 years ago. And they were managing to send people on Fulbrights. And one came and worked as an intern in a congressman's office. He's now a minister. I don't know if there is a cause and relations effect there, but it's certainly, but that's the situation. And then they sent somebody to study fisheries in this country, because fishing issues are very big for Morocco. They have the Spanish fleets, other fishing fleets that poach fish off their coast, essentially, and they need to understand. They figured out that they needed to have somebody who could talk about something which is a vital economic interest for that country. Very unglamorous. It's not studying democracy, but it's really studying. I'll finish in a moment. Try to make people more efficient. In addition, I think we should try to include all these new parties in power, representatives of new parties in power, as much as possible in all international events, in all international fora. Send them to Davos. Invite them to Davos. Invite them to everywhere, because it's only exposure that is going to provide the experience. People learn. Obviously, they are not experienced, and people learn. And finally, I think what I want to talk in terms of what are the typical dilemmas is the clash between legality and legitimacy. For those of us who are lucky enough to live in a stable political system, legitimacy and legality pretty much coincide. A president has legitimacy because he has been elected following due process. By definition, in transitional situation, legitimacy and legality do not coincide. Because if these countries had followed legality, there would not have been an Arab Spring. And the old regime would still be in power, because essentially there was, except in Morocco where the reform came from the top, essentially there would not have been a change. One of the problems for all these countries face in the long run is how to bring legitimacy and legality once again to coincide, because if only they coincide, you reach a level of stability. I think one of the things that the United States should be careful is not to try to rush the process, not to try to put too much pressure on this country to bring the two together. There is going to be, for a period in all these countries, a great deal of ambiguity about what is legal and about what is legitimate, because legitimacy in the end is in the eye of the beholder in these cases. And legality is a set of laws that are waiting to be reformed. Was it you, Radwan, who told us there are 60 laws in the parliament? That's nothing. The Moroccans have over 500 that they want to get passed before the end of the present legislature. Clearly, it's going to take some time, and I better stop here because my chair here is becoming busy.
Well,